Thank you everyone for attending today. We have a lovely presentation that's coming up, What Was Nimitz Thinking, with Jon Parshall, as he goes into all of the strategic planning behind the Battle of Midway. Just a couple of housekeeping rules to make this a better viewing experience for everyone. Please remember to mute yourself when you sign in. We will be using the chat box function for all of your questions. Feel free to add your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll get to the Q&A portion at the end of Jon's presentation. And then go ahead and set it up in speaker view for the best viewing. You'll get to see his full presentation as well as him when he is going over everything. And then lastly, just sit back, grab a beverage of choice, and enjoy. I'd like to start off by introducing our president and CEO, Mike Carr, who will give a warm welcome and then introduce our speaker today.
Good afternoon or good evening, wherever any of you may be. Welcome to our third quarter of Mojo series. This being the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Midway. We've focused on this for the last month or so, including at our September 2nd ceremony. And we're very delighted to have Jon Parshall here today to be your resource. Jon is an independent World War II scholar. He's the co-author of Shattered Sword, The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway, which is widely acclaimed as the definitive account of that crucial battle. He's widely published in the Naval War College Review and many other publications. He's also been a longtime lecturer at the U.S. Naval War College and is a frequent speaker at historic and war museums across the country. Among other things, he was also the technical advisor, as you might expect, for the 2019 remake of the movie Midway. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Jon Parshall.
Thank you very much, Michael. I really appreciate being here. Aloha, everyone. Thank you, Jacqueline, too, for inviting me to this event. And without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen. So the title of this presentation is What Was Nimitz Thinking? And this is actually the title of a new article that I recently had published in the Naval War College Review back in June of this year. And what it's meant to sort of evoke is I'm really trying to get inside Chester Nimitz's head during his lead up to the Battle of Midway. And particularly his assessment of the odds around giving battle at the time that he did and in the way that he did. Because this article is based on some new research and insights into how that planning happened. And in some ways, I think, illustrates at least one portion of the battle planning that I don't think has been properly understood by any prior histories of the battle, including Shattered Sword. So this is a piece of the historiography that's kind of lain unseen for the past 80 years or so. So without further ado, I want to accomplish 4 things today. First, I want to give just a brief overview of the first 6 months of the Pacific War and then the significance of the Battle of Midway. I'm not going to go into a blow-by-blow description of what actually happened during the battle. I just want to, give the highlights of that and then talk a little bit about the battle's impact on the war before I then turn back and talk about how Nimitz actually planned the battle. That'll be the second thing we'll go through. As a portion of that battle planning, I want to take a really close look at what's known as Point Luck, which is the location where the American carriers were pre-positioned prior to the battle. And again, illustrating how the role of Point Luck within Nimitz's battle plan has really not been properly understood up to this point. And then finally, Midway is one of those battles that just elicits a constant stream of counterfactual scenarios. And even though I've sort of gained a reputation over the years as being an historian who's not super fond of counterfactuals, as part of the Naval War College article that I recently published, I actually explored some of the counterfactual scenarios that came about as a result of my research, and I'd like to share the results of those with you as sort of a way to wrap this up. A little bit of background. One of the things that is really difficult for us at 80 years remove is to get our heads around just how incredibly dark the first half of World War II, really the first half of 1942, was for the Allies. And we as Americans tend to sort of overfocus, I think, on Pearl Harbor, and somewhat understandably. But we sometimes forget that Pearl Harbor was just one portion in a much larger plan of campaign that spanned the entirety of the Pacific Ocean, and that the main thrust of Japan's campaign at the initial portions of the war was really oriented to the south and aimed at places like Malaya, Sumatra, and Java, because it was here that the oil, the tin, the rubber, the manganese, and all of these sort of strategic materials, above all the oil, that Japan needed to make their empire self-sufficient, was to be found. And so knocking Pearl Harbor out of the equation, knocking the US Navy out of the equation, was essential to making sure that the Japanese would have the time necessary to execute that plan of attack. And so what you see in the December-January timeframe is a whole series of attacks aimed at places like Wake and Guam, Hong Kong, into Malaya, et cetera, also the Philippines. And these first phase operations are so successful that the Japanese speed up their timetable beginning in about January. And then you see in the subsequent few months, another series of operations, a bunch of battles occurring in the Southern Resource area, carrier raid against Darwin in Australia, the capture of Rabaul, et cetera, and then eventually capping it off with a carrier raid into the Bay of Bengal against India as well. So these months are some of the most disastrous during the entire war as far as Allied fortunes are concerned, and witness things like the surrender of Singapore in the middle of February, which is the largest capitulation in British military history, 138,000 soldiers lost. The invasion of Java and its capture in early March, the fall of the Bataan Peninsula in early April. And again, this is one of the largest capitulations in US history, with 75,000 Phil-American troops going into captivity. 20,000 of them will be dead within 2 months of this surrender. And finally, the fall of the Philippines as a whole in early May. So, you know, this is not a good time as far as the Allies are concerned. The Burma then falling shortly after that. And by the time we get to about May of 1942, the Japanese have carved out for themselves one of the largest empires in the history of, humankind. And they've done it at trivial cost to themselves. It took a grand total of about 11 divisions to carve this territory out. And the Japanese have completely torn the Allied strategic position to shreds during this time. So the question then for the Japanese becomes, since they have the strategic initiative, what's next? And there are a number of debates within the upper levels of the Japanese military as to what the proper follow-on operations should be. But at the end of the day, this gentleman, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who is the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet, really ends up dictating what that strategy is going to be. And Yamamoto wants to fight a battle in the Central Pacific. His target is this tiny atoll at Midway, which is way out in the Central Pacific. And those of you who are Hawaiian residents, of course, you'll be pretty familiar with this. It's at the very end of the Hawaiian island chain. The reason that Yamamoto selects this location is that it is close enough to Hawaii that he thinks it will elicit a reaction from the Americans, draw their carriers out to battle. But it's also far enough away from Oahu and the very large amounts of organic air power that are now on Oahu that can't come into play in the battle. So Midway is the target, and the Americans are going to start getting wind of that in about the middle of May. The battle itself is fought on 4 June 1942. And again, I'm not going to go through the blow by blow, but the climactic moments are that by hook or by crook, the Americans managed to put together a coordinated dive bomber attack at 10:20 in the morning that catches 3 of the Japanese carriers and disables them as a result of those attacks. So that knocks 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers in the battle out. Hiryu is the lone survivor for that time. She launches some counterattacks against the Americans, but Hiryu herself will also be caught at about dinner time and likewise knocked out of the battle. So at that point, the Japanese have lost all 4 of the carriers that came to the fight. A couple days later, the American carrier Yorktown is going to be sunk by a Japanese submarine. And that essentially ends the battle on June the 7th with 4 Japanese carriers destroyed, 1 American carrier destroyed. And in terms of the most important effects on World War II and in the Pacific War, it really does have to do with this balance of carrier forces. You can see on this slide here that if we look at what I call the carrier scorecard pre-Midway, the Americans have lost the large carrier Lexington at the Battle of Coral Sea. Saratoga's in the shop because she keeps running into submarines that have a nasty tendency to torpedo her. And the Wasp is still out in the Atlantic. So the Americans have got just 3 big flight decks. The Yorktown class carriers are in the Pacific at this point. The Japanese have got their quartet, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Shokaku and Zuikaku likewise were participants in the Battle of Coral Sea. Shokaku was damaged. Zuikaku had her air group shot to pieces. And then they had the newly converted carrier Junyo, and then this collection of light carriers that you see sort of at the bottom. Well, the outcome at Midway, the picture now looks like this. So really what's happened here is that by virtue of having sunk 4 Japanese carriers, the Americans have now clawed their way back to marginal, parity in the Pacific in terms of carrier forces. And, parity doesn't sound really very exciting, but in the dark days of 1942, parity was incredibly wonderful to have gotten back to, because it gets us out of this defensive crouch that we've been in for the first 6 months, and it allows the Americans to begin considering their options for where do we want to counterattack? How do we want to shape this war? Are there ways that we can maybe seize the strategic initiative in this war? And that is going to manifest itself within the next couple of months at Guadalcanal. Just 2 months after Yorktown is sunk to end the battle, Americans will land on Guadalcanal. And Guadalcanal and that associated campaign that's going to roll for the next 6 months or so, really, I think, is the decisive campaign in the Pacific War, in that the attritional sausage grinder that's going to be established in this neck of the woods is going to grind up dozens of Japanese warships, tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of airplanes. This is what the doctor ordered as far as the Americans are concerned. We want to move into this attritional mode of warfare so that we can start grinding the Japanese military up. So Midway is, I think, the most important naval battle in World War II, not because it changes conditions in the Pacific overnight, but because it's the gift that keeps on giving. It allows us to initiate the Guadalcanal campaign months or even a year earlier than we might have otherwise been able to do so, and start creating the kind of war that America needs to create in order to have victory against the Japanese. So that's the significance of the battle. Now I want to step back and talk about how Nimitz actually planned this battle, because again, it's easy to say in retrospect, well, looked good for us, we should be able to win this thing. This was not at all the case as we were coming into this battle. It looked very, very grim for us at this time. 2 of the most popular books on the Battle of Midway, frankly, the best-selling books on this battle forever, have always been Walter Lord's Incredible Victory and then Gordon Prang's Miracle at Midway. And just the titles of these books tell you everything you need to know about what the conventional mythos around this battle has always been. That the Americans were supposedly incredibly outnumbered by the Japanese, and that it took literally an act of God for the Americans to walk away with a victory, given the odds that they were facing. My co-author, Tony Tully, and I pushed back on that notion in our book, Shattered Sword. And basically, because if you look at the forces that were at the tip of the spear, the two carrier forces are actually very evenly matched, about 24 warships on each side, roughly the same number of aircraft. So we wrote, as we were wrapping the book up in, around 2004, it was published in 2005, we put this paragraph in one of the concluding chapters and basically said, we think that Nimitz had a better appreciation of the odds facing him leading up to this battle than a lot of authors did in the 60s, 70s, 80s when they were writing these bestsellers, that Nimitz, given the assets that he had in place, 3 aircraft carriers, was within his rights. If he put those carriers in the right place, he should have been able to offer battle at reasonably decent odds. That's what we wrote in 2004. Unfortunately, one of the things I didn't understand at the time, that was only made clear to me a couple of years later by my friend John Lundstrom, who is, a fine naval historian. He and I were literally having a beer, and he said, John, Nimitz was willing to not only go and fight at Midway at odds of 3 versus 4, he would have fought that battle even if Zuikaku had come along, 3 versus 5, and he also would have fought it even if Yorktown had not been able to be repaired after her damage at Coral Sea. In other words, Nimitz was willing to fight 2 versus 5 in terms of carriers. And, I never really was aware of that, frankly, and yet here it is in black and white in Operational Plan 2942. This is Nimitz's operational plan that he's going to issue just before this battle, and here it is. If Yorktown is not available, instructions will be issued as to the employment of the remainder of the force. It doesn't say if Yorktown's not available, we're not going. It says that we'll send the remaining carriers up there and we'll still offer battle. Well, the more I started thinking about that, and really starting at about 2020 or so, I really started to ponder this, that the common mythology around this battle has always been that, well, if Zuikaku had come along for the Japanese and the Americans were fighting 3 carriers versus 5, that could have been, absolutely disastrous for the Americans. What if it had actually been that Zuikaku showed up and Yorktown didn't, and now it's 2 versus 5? That just bordered on reckless, as I put here on the slide. The original title of this article was Nimitz crazy? What was he doing, thinking that he would accept odds of that nature and actually come and offer battle? So that then prompted me to start digging into the source materials to try to understand Nimitz's mindset and how he was assessing these odds so that we can evaluate the battle plan that he came out with. And likewise, what might have happened in some of those scenarios had they actually come to pass. We need to put ourselves into Nimitz's head, and that's difficult to do from 80 years removed, but we do have some tools and some source material that allows us to make that happen. The first thing we need to keep in mind is that Nimitz is working for this guy on the right. We got Nimitz here on the left, and we have Ernest King on the right. Ernest King is Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy. He is an extremely difficult individual to work for. He is very, very bright, extremely capable, and does not suffer fools gladly at all. And at this point in the war, King really does not trust that Nimitz is the right guy to be running the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Doesn't think that Nimitz is necessarily as aggressive as he ought to be. And King is not the kind of guy that gives people second chances. If he thinks you're the wrong dude, he is going to yank you out of there. In fact, when Nimitz goes out to take up his appointment, he writes to his wife and says, I will be lucky to last 6 months. So we need to bear in mind that there's tension between these two gentlemen here, and that Nimitz has got to prove to King that he is the right guy. Part of that is being driven by the fact that King himself is living in a pressure cooker. Both of these gentlemen are. As I've already explained, the war situation in the Pacific is disastrous. It's also disastrous basically everywhere else in the world as well. In the Mediterranean, on the Eastern Front, and particularly on the eastern seaboard of the United States. At the same time all of this is going on, German U-boats are turning the eastern seaboard into a shooting gallery. And King is under a lot of pressure back in DC to fix that problem too. He's getting memos from George Marshall. He's getting memos from Franklin Delano Roosevelt saying, why aren't you turning this situation around more rapidly, Admiral King? And so, you know, pressure tends to flow downhill. King, likewise, you know, being under pressure, all of that pressure is now rolling down to Nimitz as well to fix this situation. And as I alluded to, you know, the relationship between these two men is far from solid at this point. So what are some of the places that we can go looking for clues as to how Nimitz and King are evaluating the odds? The first is what we historians refer to as the Gray Book, which has been declassified within the last 10 or 15 years or so and digitized. This is the running intelligence summary that was kept by Pac Fleet out in Hawaii of all of the message traffic back and forth between Admiral Nimitz and Washington, D.C. and all the other subsidiary commands. And so if you go through this thing, which is thousands of pages long, you find pages that look like this. And so you can see a message from ComInch to SINCPAC, that is to say, Commander-in-Chief to CNC Pacific Fleet, King to Nimitz, likewise from SINCPAC back to ComInch. So by reading these messages, which are pretty candid in terms of how they're evaluating the situation, we can get a sense for what these individuals are thinking about and how they're viewing the situation in the Pacific at this time. Likewise, for Nimitz to be able to evaluate the odds against him, he needs to have an understanding about how effective his own weapon systems are going to be. And for that, we can go looking into extemporary or extant doctrinal tracks. So this is the Fleet Carrier Battle Force Doctrine, and nobody, you know, gets as much joy as I do out of reading hundreds and hundreds of pages of dry doctrine on how you're actually supposed to conduct a dive bomber attack and things of that nature. But in here, you can build models for how we perceived how effective those weapons were going to be. And then finally, of course, we can go and look at Nimitz's battle plan itself, Op 2942, and we're going to get to that a little bit later. In terms of the timeline of how the battle unfolds, middle of May, 14 May, Hypo, which is the code-breaking station in Pearl Harbor, gets the first inklings that there's some sort of an operation up the Japanese sleeve, and it seems to be aimed at Midway and timed for early June. 2 days later, Nimitz is on board with that assessment. 2 days after that, King is also broadly on board, although his own intelligence people at an organization called Op-20G are a little skeptical about how Hypo is analyzing this situation. There's going to be a real tension between those two organizations, which sort of mirrors the tension that we see between King and Nimitz at this time. On 26 May, the Enterprise and the Hornet make it back to Pearl Harbor. And just a day after that, the Yorktown, which has been damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea, she took a couple of near misses, limps back into Pearl Harbor as well, trailing a 10-mile-long oil slick behind her. And that very night, Nimitz gathers his commanders together and issues Op 2942 and briefs those commanders on this upcoming battle that they're going to have to hustle up to. There are two main wild cards that Nimitz has to be balancing while he's crafting this battle plan. And the first, of course, is Yorktown. Can we patch this ship up in time to get her back up around Midway so that she can offer battle? The initial indications are that, yeah, we should be able to literally patch her together, but we're not going to know for sure until we get her into dry dock on the morning of the 27th. But as soon as Yorktown docks, the task force commander, Admiral Fletcher, lets Nimitz know that I think we'll probably be able to make it up there. The second wild card is this beautiful carrier, the Zuikaku, which was at the Battle of Coral Sea, had her air group very badly shot up. But there's the possibility that between her surviving aircraft and the aircraft on her sister Shokaku, that the Japanese might be able to put together some sort of a composite air group that would be sufficiently large that they can bring her out to Midway. And so it's crucial to understand whether or not she's going to be coming to the party or not. As I say, there's a conflict between Hypo and Op-20G in evaluating whether or not Zuikaku is coming to the party. And you can see it here in the estimate of the situation that Nimitz issues on 26 May that's contained in the Gray Book. That on the left-hand side, we have King's estimate from Hypo or from Op-20G. They think that carrier divisions 1 and 2 plus another carrier for 5 carriers are going to come to the battle. Meanwhile, SyncPac and Hypo are saying, nope, there's only going to be 4 carriers. And this tension is going to go on for the next week or so. In terms of other things that Nimitz thinks he knows, the Americans are under the impression that the Japanese are going to be operating in 2 task forces, probably 1 or 2 carriers apiece. This is wrong. This is a case of mirror imaging on the Americans' part, that since we operate our carriers in penny packets, the Japanese are not going to put all of theirs in one basket. In fact, the Japanese are going to put all of the carriers in one basket. Nimitz knows that he's going to have the air power on Midway. It's about 90 aircraft. It's polyglot group that are from the Army Air Forces, the Marines, the Navy. It's a real patchwork of aircraft, but he's hustled up everything he can scrape up, and they're up in Midway. He's also going to have about a dozen fleet submarines that he'll be able to use as well. Midway's air power and those submarines are absolutely crucial to this battle plan because they are going to be used to hopefully whittle down the Japanese carrier force enough so we feel comfortable committing our own lesser number of carriers to battle. So attritionally, those sets of assets have got to do their job in order for us to feel comfortable about committing our carriers. One of the things Nimitz very much does not want to do at this point of the war is swap losses with the Japanese on a 1-for-1 basis. So if we see some of these passages out of the Gray Book here, the fact that we lost Lexington at the Battle of Coral Sea and only sank the small carrier Shoho in return, that is not what Nimitz wanted. He points out too at the bottom that the general situation with respect to carriers is such that we must husband our present carrier strength for future operations. So he does not want to put his own remaining carriers in a situation where they are committed to a knockdown, drag-out fight that might extract heavy casualties amongst our own carrier forces. That is a no-no. Finally, in terms of just sort of the math around the battle, U.S. fleet doctrine at this point predicts that 1 squadron of 18 dive bombers should be sufficient to knock out an enemy carrier. The math is that we think that 1 plane out of every 6 is going to land a bomb on its target, and that 3 good bomb hits ought to knock a carrier out. Well, if that is true, then given the fact that each American carrier has 2 dive bomber squadrons on it, that means that if they can attack first, they should be able to knock out 2 enemy carriers for every 1 American carrier. There are a lot of ifs in that equation, but again, if Nimitz can get his forces into a position where they can ambush the Japanese, they should be able to inflict disproportionate damage on those forces. So now let's take a look at the battle plan that Nimitz issues to his forces. And this is a scan of the submarine disposition. You can see that there's a series of patrol sectors that are kind of fanned out to the northwest of the island of Midway. The Japanese are anticipated to show up again off to the northwest and should be detected hopefully at around 175, 200 nautical miles, that sort of range, and then they're going to close on the island of Midway. And then here is Point Luck, which is where the American carriers are going to congregate prior to the battle, up well off to the northeast of the battle itself. The game plan is going to be those submarines are going to whittle away at the carrier force. Our air power is going to whittle away at that carrier force. And if we feel comfortable that sufficient damage has been done to those assets, then and only then will we bring our own carriers into the battle. So this brings us to the role of point luck. And this is the piece that I don't think has been properly understood literally for 80 years, what the position of point luck itself dictated the battle would look like. Because if you take a look at how far away point luck is from the battle, those American carriers are anticipated to start 360 nautical miles away from where the Japanese are going to be showing up. That's a really long way. Because if you start superimposing the strike ranges of first our torpedo planes and our fighters, and even the relatively longer range dive bombers can only reach out about 225 miles. So in order to get within launch position of the Japanese carrier force, we're going to have to steam our carriers a minimum of 180, 185 nautical miles. Even if the Japanese cut the corner and continue closing on Midway, we're still going to have to steam, 150, 160 nautical miles in order to get within launch range of the Japanese. Well, what does that mean? It means that we're going to have to spend probably 6 to 8 hours of high-speed steaming to get within that launch point, which means that even if I get good intel in the morning sometime that, hey, the submarines have done a great job, we've damaged a couple of Japanese carriers, come on down. By the time the American carriers can get within launch range is probably at the earliest going to be mid-afternoon and more likely late afternoon. And once you start getting in that time frame, now you're raising the specter of having to do a nighttime landing of those aircraft. And nobody wants to do that. Those are really dangerous. So I really think that that means that because of point luck's distant placement, Nimitz is almost by default creating what was going to be a multi-day battle, wherein day one was devoted to the usage of those attritional assets, the Midway air power, the submarines, to whittle things down. And day two would be the carrier battle, and if and only if we feel that it's advisable, that there would not have been any carrier combat at all on day one, just because they're too far apart. What I think it means in terms of interpretation is that Nimitz is using point luck as a risk management tool. It allows his two carrier commanders, Fletcher and Spruance, and Nimitz himself too, to make some sort of an informed go, no-go decision based on how this battle is going before they're gonna, actually make the leap to bringing their carriers into the fight. Because if the battle's going poorly, our carriers are well outside scouting range of the Japanese carriers. They are now in a position that if they need to, they can disengage cleanly and get out of there. Nimitz makes it very clear to both his carrier commanders, I do not want you in a knockdown drag out. If worse comes to worse and things are not going well in this battle, don't risk the carriers, get them out of there. Leave the defense of the island to the Marines. That's what they're there for. And furthermore, even if they do take Midway, I don't think the Japanese can keep it. It's going to be impossible for them to hang on to it, given that it's so close to Hawaii and our submarines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he's very clear with his carrier commanders that I don't want you to commit unless you feel you can do good damage to the enemy. And that is reflected in the guidance that he then gives to his two subordinates, these two gentlemen, Frank Jack Fletcher, who is in overall command of the battle and is going to be on board the Yorktown, and Fletcher's subordinate, Raymond Spruance, who's commanding the task force that's got Hornet and Enterprise in it. Before these guys sail, Nimitz issues this letter of instruction, which contains one of the most famous naval orders. If you're a naval historian, you've heard about this order, that Nimitz explicitly tells them that you are to be guided by this principle of calculated risk, which he says here is interpreted to mean the avoidance of exposure of your force to attack unless you think that you can do greater damage to the enemy. Again, if you're in a bad position, get out. Do not expose your forces to attack by the enemy in a disadvantageous position. So this is the instruction that those two gentlemen go out to battle with. Well, that's obviously not how the historical battle went down, right? On June 4th itself, there certainly were American carrier attacks on the first day of the battle. And the whole thing, all the carrier actions really happened on that first day, June 4th. So what happened to change this whole battle plan? The answer is that Nimitz pivots. Here's what's happening. On 30th of May, Yorktown departs. And she's 2 days behind the Hornet and the Enterprise. Just the day after she leaves, Hypo conclusively determines that Zuikaku is not coming to the party, that some of her aviators are being detached from her air group and are being sent to some of the other carrier commands that are going up to the Aleutians. And so Hypo is able to determine then there's no way that Zuikaku is going to be in this operation. On 2 June, Yorktown arrives at Point Luck and finds her 2 sister ships already there on station. And that very afternoon, Nimitz sends an order, not an order, actually. It's interesting how he phrases this. You can see this in the Gray Book again. He sends a radio signal wherein it was suggested to Task Force 16 and 17 that a position further to the west might be advantageous. Well, Frank Jack Fletcher is nobody's fool, and he understands that suggestions from 4-star admirals need to be paid close attention to. And that very night, he moves both carrier task forces about 175 nautical miles to the west. This is roughly the location that they're going to be in when battle begins on 4 June. And it's funny because a lot of the histories of this battle refer to the location the Americans were in on 4 June as being Point Luck. That is not true. Point Luck never moved. Point Luck was always way off to the northeast of the island. The carriers moved, not Point Luck. But what that does is it brings the American carriers much closer to where the Japanese are supposed to show up, about 185 nautical miles away from where they did actually show up. And that in turn compresses the timescale of this whole battle. So what's going on there? Well, I think Nimitz is breathing a little easier. He knows now that he's got 3 carriers on station. He knows that Zuikaku is not coming to the dance. And so he's now willing to turn up the dial a little bit in terms of the amount of risk that he's willing to accept. And so that compresses this battle down into from a multi-day plan down to a single-day plan. And I think that demonstrates just how aggressive and flexible Nimitz was as a commander. Admiral King has got some doubts about Nimitz at this point. He should not have. Nimitz was actually a very aggressive commander. The problem for Nimitz is, though, that during the actual battle, those attritional assets that he was counting on, the Midway Air Group and those submarines, do nothing. So they completely fail in that role. And not only that, but one of those 3 carriers, the Hornet, is likewise almost completely ineffectual. There's an incident during the battle called the Flight to Nowhere. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that, here's a picture of it. This is a diagram showing around 0910 the number of aircraft formations that are up in the air from the various carriers. And you can see at the top here, we've got a composite group of dive bombers and fighters from the Hornet, which are flying directly off to the west. And what happened here was that Hornet's captain, Mark Mitcher, made the decision that since he thought the Japanese were going to be operating in 2 carrier task forces, and it seemed like only one of them had been detected by the Americans, that by God, on my own watch, I'm going to go off and take my entire air group and not tell my boss Spruance about this, but I'm going to go and find that 2nd carrier task force. So he sends all of his airplanes off to the west, and instead he finds nothing. So Hornet is essentially useless as far as the carrier combat is concerned on this day. That's a huge flub. And yet, because Yorktown and Enterprise are on their game, by hook or by crook, they have sufficient firepower to destroy the Japanese carrier task force, and we come out with a win. So that brings us now to the counterfactual scenarios. And what I want to explore at this point is looking at what might have happened if Zuikaku had been along to the dance, And likewise, what might have happened if Zuikaku had been along, but Yorktown had not? What's a 3 versus 5 battle look like? What's a 2 versus 5 battle look like? And to do that, I'm actually using an article that was published by a pair of Spanish economists, Anelli Bongers and Jose Torres, who wrote an article for the Military Operations Research Journal back in 2020. And in this article, what they're doing is they're using a stochastic mathematical model of the battle to, predict outcomes and run counterfactuals. And by way of disclosure, I worked with both of the authors to help them build this model that they would use in this article. And then I worked directly with Jose to expand their article's model to accommodate the 2 scenarios that we're now going to explore. But that's the tool that I'm using. And also, by way of admission, I don't understand stochastic modeling, okay? So the analog that we're using here, just like Nimitz didn't necessarily understand how Station Hypo did its code breaking, but trusted that the wizards in the basement at Hypo knew what they were doing. I am relying on 2 PhD economists that they know what they're doing when it comes to stochastic mathematical modeling. The 4 dummies explanation of what's happening here is that we're creating a mathematical model that looks at a whole bunch of different variables. How likely is it that an aircraft will find its target? How likely is it that I can actually get into attack position and then drop a bomb on it? Will I be intercepted by enemy combat air patrol fighters? That sort of thing. And the probabilities of having that happen are not fixed variables. They lie along a distribution curve. And so what you do is you build this general model and then you tune it by using hundreds of thousands of simulations to dial it into where you think it is replicating historical outcomes in a reasonable manner. Once you've got that tuned model, then you can use it to explore some of these what-if scenarios. So even though the math is above my head, nevertheless, that's the tool that we're going to use to explore this. Crucially, one of the things that they built into this model is whether or not that flight to nowhere actually happens. So they've got a little switch in here that lets us turn on, do I get good Hornet this morning or do I get bad Hornet, which is historical Hornet? And so that's a switch that we can turn on when we're exploring these scenarios as well. Let's take a look at the actual historical battle, which was 4 Imperial Navy carriers versus 3 American carriers. As we all know, the results in the actual battle were that the Japanese lost all 4 of their carriers. We lost the Yorktown, so 4-1. The tuned stochastic model suggests that the Japanese would have lost all 4 of their carriers and that the Americans should have lost 1, probably damaged to a 2nd. And there are a couple of, that's with bad Hornet. Okay, so that's the results with bad Hornet. With good Hornet, if Hornet shows up and does what it's supposed to do, the Americans should win this battle 4 carriers to 0. Okay, a much better result than we actually got historically. One of the implications that come out of that, first of all, is the authors of the article say, they show that in fact, Midway was a battle that the Japanese probably were not in a good position to win. And this is an important statement on their part. And I think one that I've not seen from any other historian, but I think it's really important, that the final result was conditioned by the timing imposed by the earlier attack on the Midway Air Base. When Admiral Nagumo launches his morning strike, uses a half of his aircraft to go out and hit Midway in the morning, in effect, he's committing half of his combat power to an objective that is marginal to his accomplishment of his mission. He doesn't know that there's an enemy carrier force there, but not having that half of his aircraft for the first half of that battle, in essence, puts him behind the power curve and he's never going to be able to catch up. So I thought that was a really interesting insight on their part. The second implication is my implication, which is that Mark Mitcher sank the Yorktown. That because of the flight to nowhere and the fact that Yorktown ends up absorbing 2 Japanese counterattacks in the afternoon, that was all avoidable. That if Hornet had done what it was supposed to do in the morning, Hornet's aircraft actually should have attacked the Japanese first, because remember, her torpedo plane squadron actually did attack the Japanese, peeled off from the flight to nowhere and went and attacked the Japanese. It is more than likely that Hornet would have killed 1 or 2 Japanese carriers around 09:15, 09:30, leaving the remaining 2 to be cleaned up by Enterprise and Yorktown later on the battle. If there's no Kido Butai, there's no counterattack against the Yorktown, the Americans should have won this thing 4-zip by lunchtime and it's over. But that's not what happened because of bad Hornet. So for a commander, I think you can make a pretty credible case that he is responsible for sinking the Yorktown in this battle. If you take a look at 5 versus 3, with bad Hornet in the mix, Bongers and Torres's model predicts that the Japanese will lose 3 carriers, maybe 3.5 or 4. The Americans are going to lose 2. If good Hornet shows up that morning, the Japanese are going to lose all 5 of their carriers. The Americans will lose 1 apiece. That's kind of interesting because, again, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, the common wisdom had always been that, oh my God, what if Zuikaku showed up to this battle? That would have been, just doom as far as Midway or Nimitz is concerned. It looks as if it would not have necessarily been, that even Zuikaku's presence would not have saved Nagumo from very heavy losses. And this brings to the fore the incredible advantage that the Americans have in terms of scouting assets. We have so many more planes in the air, particularly PBY Catalinas, that are out looking for the Japanese than they have aircraft looking for us, that we have a huge advantage in scouting assets, and that makes it more probable that we are going to get in our licks first. And given the fact that we, can theoretically knock out 2 Japanese carriers for every 1 that we bring to the battle, that first strike capability is crucial. Nevertheless, Zuikaku's presence does mean that we are fairly likely to lose 2 carriers in the course of that action. Would Nimitz and King have accepted losses of 2 carriers to kill 5 Japanese? Yeah, absolutely, but it would have been a little more painful. And then finally, we come to 5 versus 2. So the model predicts that if bad Hornet shows up, the Americans are going to lose both of their carriers. The Japanese are going to lose 2. And even if good Hornet shows up, it can get a lot better. Maybe 2.5 Japanese carriers sunk to the 2 American carriers sunk. And in terms of actual firepower kills, the model predicts that it's not just 2 carriers sunk. I mean, the Americans are absolutely swamped and destroyed. The Japanese would do enough damage to sink 3 or 4 carriers had they been there. So this really is a carrier too far. This is a battle that it would have been very, very difficult for the Americans to win. And the results most likely would have been the Americans swapping losses, losing 2 carriers and sinking 2 Japanese, which is exactly not what Nimitz wanted or the King would have wanted either. So the problem here for Nimitz is that he really doesn't know that his other attritional assets were not up to the task. And this is the scenario then when their failures, their weakness really becomes much more apparent. And it also illustrates that in the historical battle, Yorktown really was sort of the margin of error, the insurance policy, if you will. That Yorktown's presence gives us enough additional firepower that even if we get bad Hornet, we still have enough in the tank to get the job done to assure final victory. And so with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I would love to answer anybody's question.
Thank you, John. That was a great presentation. Very, very informative. As you mentioned, we will be taking questions now. Please chat in your questions and I will help facilitate those. We have a few more minutes that we can kind of go through a Q&A. I have one question to kind of kick it off, John, and that is, why did it take so many years for this article to come out?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. Well, for one thing, a lot of what I'm doing here is digging into the Gray Book, and the Gray Book was not declassified until relatively recently, and it was not widely available either. In fact, it's been interesting watching historians like Ian Toll and others, really start to dig into that source material now that it's become available. So I think that is one factor. I think too that just the process of history in general is non-linear, that sometimes you just have to have these sort of aha moments or head scratcher kind of moments. And I guess nobody had the head scratcher around the odds in the same way that I did. But I think it's interesting that what put that into my head was just sort of this offhand comment by John Lundstrom that, John, the Nimitz is willing to go up there. And that sort of turned on a light bulb in my head, I guess, that made me willing to dig into it.
That's great.
Yeah, I'd mentioned that that's not the first time that John Lundstrom has done that for me too. So yeah, in any case.
I actually have a follow-up question to that, and it's what have you learned since the article was published? Like, what have you learned since then?
Well, the article just came out, just 2 months ago. So I have to say that there hasn't been any dramatic stuff since then. Although I would say that since the publication of our book in 2005, we've continued learning a lot of things about Midway. Some of the ways in which there was an incident on the night of June 4th and the 5th between an American submarine, the Tambor, and a couple of Japanese heavy cruisers that I don't think has been properly understood. We came across some new source material that allowed us to analyze that. My co-author, Tony Tully, has continued working. He's got a Chinese co-author, a guy named Liu Yu. And he's continued digging into, why was the Japanese scouting plan so terrible? And it turns out that that was all driven by the intel estimates that the Japanese carrier commanders had in their hands, and was able to develop new source materials from the Japanese side that showed those drivers in action. So, if I had to publish Shattered Sword again, there would definitely be things that would be new in there.
Great, thank you. We have a couple questions that came in. First one from Mike Carr. He said he didn't know about the flight to nowhere. And was that ever portrayed in either of the movies?
No, it's not in either of the movies. The problem with movies as a medium is you have to be very careful to introduce the minimum number of characters and to not get off on side tangents around the narrative. And so, the flight to nowhere doesn't really fit into a lot of those sort of formulas. Movies are cool, but they're sort of limited in the number of things they can cover. In fact, if you look at the 2019 movie, which I was associated with, not necessarily to my happiness, basically that movie only covers what Enterprise did during the battle. It barely talks about the Yorktown's experience or the Hornets experience. So that's another case of you have to narrow down the scope of the movie. But no, Flight to Nowhere has never really been depicted. I will say that if you want to read more about the Flight to Nowhere, Craig Simon's book on Midway, which came out in 2014 or so, is really good. He really digs into that in great detail.
Thank you. Another question, were there any repercussions or disciplinary action towards the Hornet for their deviation from the plan?
Okay, so, you would think that if you've had a big boo-boo like that there would be some repercussions. Craig also does a really good job of covering this in his book. The answer is no. Mark Mitcher had already had his ticket punched to Rear Admiral even before the battle. He knew that he was going to get a new billet. And it's interesting, though, you would have thought that he would have gotten command of a carrier task force. He does not. He's sort of shunted off to the side and given command of a patrol wing initially after that. It's pretty clear that Mark Mitcher gun-decked his after-action report. And explicitly, when Admiral Spruance puts in his own after-action report, he says, if you are trying to weigh details of the battle and you've got the Enterprise report or the Hornet report to pick from. Choose the Enterprise. So Spruance was well aware that there was a bit of a cover-up in Hornet's report. And it seems that Mitcher was then sort of really put in the doghouse. He was in the doghouse for a good year and a half before he was finally rehabilitated and would eventually end up commanding not just a task force, but be the fast task force carrier commander around all of our task forces at places like the Battle of the Philippine Sea. So one of the things about Admiral Nimitz as a person was that he was very willing to give people second chances. And I think this is a case where he made the decision that Mitcher was worth rehabilitating and putting back into a command situation. I'm pretty sure that Nimitz never made the mental, what do I want to say, the association that I just did to say that, yeah, Mark Mitcher sank the Yorktown, okay? I don't think that Nimitz would have ever conceived of it in those terms, and that's probably something that ended up saving Mitcher's career.
Thank you. We've got a question from Gary. Can you comment on the effectiveness of the torpedo bombers versus the dive bombers?
Yeah. The torpedo planes at Midway, the American torpedo planes specifically, were kind of a low point in the battle. We were flying an older airframe at this point, the TBD Devastator, which was reaching the end of its life. Frankly, this battle had reached the end of its life. It was very slow, and the torpedoes it was carrying had to be launched from pretty low altitude and at pretty low speed. So these things were horrifically vulnerable to Japanese fighter opposition. You know, a Zero fighter could just run rings around these things, and did. One of the torpedo plane squadrons, VT-8 from the Hornet, famously attacks the Japanese and is annihilated. 15 planes in, 15 planes shot down, one guy left alive in the water. And the two other torpedo plane squadrons, VT-6 and VT-3, were likewise handled very, very roughly, in some cases coming home with 3 planes out of 15. So, and none of those torpedo plane squadrons scored any hits against the enemy. So this is the last time the TBD Devastator is going to be used in combat. The Americans very quickly realized that this plane is just not useful anymore, and we have to get the newer TBF Avenger into service, because our torpedo planes are just sitting ducks.
Thank you. We have our last question from Beverly. Can you comment on the importance of Nimitz's War College exercise experience and driving his decision-making at Midway?
That's a great question. The U.S. Navy has a long culture of wargaming. And so when we take a look at things like doctrinal tracks, a lot of those doctrinal precepts are informed by the wargaming that occurred at the U.S. Naval War College. One of the other sources that I took a look at, frankly, were the series of fleet exercises that occurred between the war. What was the results of all of those fleet exercises? How did that inform Nimitz as well? There's no question that Nimitz was heavily influenced by those war games, that the results of those war games, particularly the need to get in the first blow if you are a carrier force. Attacking first is everything, because the war games at the War College had made it clear that the aircraft carrier is an incredibly powerful attack asset, but it's not able to defend itself very well. And so it's important then to be in a position to detect the enemy first, to get that information in the hands of your carrier commander so that you can get your aircraft off the flight deck and hit those guys before you get hit. And that drove a large number of decisions leading up to the battle and also during the battle itself. The need to hit first was paramount.
Thank you. We had one more question just come in. Why was the Yorktown so badly damaged that it could not be salvaged and repaired?
Yeah, another really good question. Yorktown absorbed two counterattacks during the afternoon of 4 June. She was hit first by a full squadron of dive bombers from the Hiryu, and then subsequently by a smaller group of torpedo aircraft that hit her so badly that she took on a pronounced list, and it was decided to abandon the ship. But she was still floating, right? And she was floating then for the next 2 days after the battle. What this illustrates is just how incredibly tough the Yorktown class carriers were. Yorktown and her sister Hornet, though both would be lost during the war, absorbed a tremendous amount of punishment. And in the case of the Yorktown, we were bringing a fleet tug out from Pearl Harbor to drag her back to Pearl Harbor. And absolutely, she would have been salvaged and repaired had she not been attacked on the morning of 7 June by a Japanese submarine. That submarine managed to sneak under the destroyer pickets that were around her and hit her with torpedoes sufficient that she no longer had the reserve buoyancy necessary, and that's what finally sank her. But yeah, there's no question in my mind that had it not been for that final torpedo attack, Yorktown would have been successfully salvaged.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And thank you, everyone. We want to give a big shout out to Jon Parshall again for his wonderful presentation today. Thank you all for joining us. Just wanted to give some quick ways to connect with us following this presentation on social media. Also, a shout out to our partners, the Old Salt Coffee Company, who help support this virtual series. And lastly, just a reminder, if you enjoyed today's presentation, this is a free series for our members. If you'd like more information on becoming a member, I have the contact information here, and you can join us for future events. And thank you again, Jon. It was a fascinating presentation. We really appreciate you being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it a lot.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Come and visit on one of these days.
Yes, we'll do that.
Okay.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Thanks.